Uh, First off, we all know that plastics have a lot of health impacts, especially when they get broken down by UV light mostly, and their polymer bonds weaken and snap, and they become quite fragile. These end up being, well, turning into microplastics, nanoplastics, and of course they leach as they exist. So a lot of the issues with microplastics is they get ingested, mostly with aquatic life, and it can cause starvation and suffocation. Sorry, this is quite a bleak topic, so hopefully you're all okay with that. Nanoplastics, on the other hand, are very actually hard to study, and there isn't much study about them, but they have been found in rainwater, so obviously they're everywhere in the world now, and if it's in rainwater, it's in your drinking water. One of the biggest negative impacts of plastics over the last few years, well, 10 years, I guess, has been when it was found that BPA impacts male fertility. So our grandfathers had about 100 million in our sperm count. Modern men have about 50 million, and we have fertility issues around 40 million. So that just shows what sort of serious problem we're dealing with. And there are tons of other effects. That's just one that's been quite heavily publicized. So normally when we think about recycling, it's quite a positive idea. You know, we take plastics out of the landfill and put it back into products. We are pretty sure it can be done, indefinitely. We think it's good for the planet. And, we think that individuals need to recycle. It's our responsibility to take these products and put it through the recycling system. Rather than it being, a producer's responsibility. So the big issue with recycling, and the misconception I want to bring up, is that recycling doesn't really work when we talk about plastics. So 70% of our recycling is actually diverted directly into landfills because of contamination. It's market reliant, and only types 1 and 2 on the resin scale are actually reliably sold. And there's just too much plastic for recyclers to really deal with for the most part. The MRFs just can't really deal with that volume. So of that 30% that does make it through the recycling program, it's mostly cardboard and metals because they actually have markets, and only about 9% of plastics ever created have actually managed to go through recycling. Before 2018, most of this recycling was sent off to China, but due to a documentary that I think was made in 2016 or 17 called Plastic China, you can view it on Vimeo, a really, really good documentary. But China implemented national sword policy, which meant that the world's recycling couldn't go through China anymore. So now a lot of our recycling, especially in New Zealand, was sent through Malaysia, and I believe is still sent through Malaysia, which is having quite an issue with illegal recycling. They just don't have the regulations in place to deal with it. And due to contamination, we actually had one full container of recycling bounce around the world for about a year before it ended up back in New Zealand. So that's a bit of waste resources. So the reason why the recycling doesn't work is that it was never really meant to work. It was more of something created to give a false sense of activism. And this can be seen through companies such as Keep America Beautiful, which had the famous Crying Indian adverts. And a lot of it was about changing from multi-reusable materials down to single use. So we all remember the glass Coke bottle. They still have some on occasion. And changing that to plastic or changing it to a thinner glass in terms for beer bottles allowed companies to send out the products and the waste that was cheap enough that they didn't need to get the bottles back. So a good example is the US used to have 600 different breweries. Now they have about 60. That's because traditionally breweries could only supply an area that was as far as a truck could take the beer each day, because they needed to bring the bottles back for them to be washed and reused. Now Heineken can send beer all over the world because the bottles are cheap enough that they don't need to get it back. So the markets have opened up, and essentially a lot of these companies have managed to maintain, if not a monopoly, somewhat close to that. So how we know that this is the case is that products are very difficult to clean, and they often use very different types of materials within one bottle. So Coca-Cola, for example, uses a PET bottle made out of PET plastic, but the label is actually PVC. And until recently, there was actually no machine to go through and strip off the label. So most of those couldn't really be easily recycled unless you had someone pulling the PVC label off of it. So mixed streams of waste are very, very hazardous to the MRF, the Materials Recovery Facility or Recycling Center. So I'll just zip down my notes to save a bit of time, sorry. So part of it is we throw all the rubbish in one bin. If we really expected recycling to work, we wouldn't be doing that. We'd have more of a German model of taking it apart and putting into multiple different bins. Having it as one bin just means it's too difficult and doesn't end up getting done. Metals and glass are a lot better for recycling because they are actually infinitely recyclable, where plastic can only be recycled a couple of times. I believe for HDPE, high density polyethylene, can be recycled up to 40 times. But again, it never really is because of the low rates, only 9% actually getting recycled. And every time a plastic goes through the recycling process, it breaks the bonds. So it can't actually be recycled, it can be downcycled. So carpet is a famous use of a lot of recycled plastic, but once it becomes carpet, it's never going to become a bottle or anything ever again. It's probably going to end up in the landfill. So I'm going to skip compostable plastics, just don't really have time when I get us all talking rather than you just hearing me speak. So a bit of a summary of the entire chain. It takes about 1.75 liters of petroleum to make 1 kilo of plastic. About 10 to 20% of all of the plastic in our oceans come from the raw plastic pellets that were never actually turned into a product. So, this is quite, quite serious. Most of it was either blown out of the factories that were making them or during transport to factories. When it has a product, it also has a negative health impact. If you have that weird taste when you're drinking out of a bottle that's been sitting in the sun, that weird taste is the UV light breaking down the plastic and leaching chemicals into your drink. It has a relatively short maximum lifespan. Plastic can be used for about 20 years just because of the UV light sensitivity and so on. So essentially what I'm getting at is that 100% of all plastics will either end up in the landfill or as litter eventually, and most of the litter will end up in the oceans, which can do fun stuff like choke sea turtles or break down to microplastics, get eaten by small shrimp and fish, which fill up their stomachs. It's non-nutritious, so causes starvation. And then even after that, it can still turn into nanoplastics, which can come down the rainwater, as I mentioned. And plastics can persist to up to about 450 years. We think, we've only had plastics for about 70 years. So we don't really know what the very long-term impacts are. So what I'd really like you to break off and discuss, or we can discuss in one group, because we've got 35 people, so maybe one group is best, is do we want plastics? Do we need them? And should the public continue to have responsibility for plastic waste? Do we have to use plastic? What are alternatives? And looking at the health impacts, such as the plastic and aquatic life, can we use PLA and other compostable plastics to get out of the situation? Which, if we're interested, I'll tell you more about those, but let's jump into the discussion and see if we get there. Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Hello.
Hey, hello, Helen.
Hi, Hugh. I just want to jump in here and say that I think that we should be focused on going towards reusables instead of compostable plastic. I'm sure you know the problems with compostable plastics. I don't need to say more here, but definitely a focus on reusables is a high priority, I think, for New Zealand.
Yeah, completely agree. And they found that the energy that goes into a reusable, we'll say a glass or chromatic cup, we'll say a coffee cup, it only takes about 12 uses or 14 uses in order for it to be energy neutral, for the same waste as a takeaway.
Yeah, and I think that I always find that quite interesting when people talk about the number of uses, and isn't it terrible that it's 100 uses of a reusable bag But I think that's really misleading, because I have a reusable bag that I've had for 10 years. So I think that that's not really a fair way of measuring, because obviously the point of reusables is to have one and use it, reuse it, not to just carry on consuming more and more stuff.
Exactly. And it depends on where the energy comes from as well when you're talking about energy. If you're in the South Island of New Zealand, like I'm sure a bunch of us are, South Island is about 97% hydro at the moment and about 3% wind. North Island is mostly geothermal with a little bit of hydro and tiny bit of coal, like 20%, which isn't great. But if you have something made in New Zealand compared to something made in, we'll say, China or India, the amount of energy we use doesn't really matter because our sources are comparatively so green. So there's also that, and the end of life cycle, as we've discussed. So I completely agree, Helen.
Yeah. Cool.
Any other questions? There we go.
Can I ask a question about the carbon footprint in terms of reusing and having a container deposit scheme? Because I would have thought that the carbon footprint for reusing bottles or tins or whatever they're washing out would be much lower than recycling. But I heard somewhere along the way that it wasn't. And I do always kind of think that ultimately that we are looking at the carbon footprint of whatever we are using.
Reusable is a lot better than recycling because, of course, there's a lot of energy, even if you're talking about, we'll say, a glass bottle. It takes a lot of energy to melt glass in the first place. So if you have to recycle it, then there is quite a large energy input. When if you just have to wash it, it's comparatively very low. I can't remember the number of cycles it needs to be equal to the single bottle or whatever the case may be. But yeah, reuse is much better than recycle.
So if we had a container deposit scheme and we sent, say, bottles or glass bottles or whatever types of containers to be washed, that definitely does have a lower carbon footprint than obviously using new or single use.
Yeah, especially if you can keep it local. Like I wouldn't imagine if you were sending these things back to China, then things probably get quite difficult. But we'll say you've got a New Zealand brewery that takes back its bottles, washes them and then sends them out again. You can generally get about 40 uses out of that bottle. A good example is actually Aylesbury Creamery in Christchurch is a milk supplier that does take back their bottles. And he's saved, I think, over 200,000 bottles since he started.
Cool. There's a question in the chat box from Alexander Bryan. Can all plastics only ever be downcycled?
No, they can be recycled, but eventually they will be downcycled. Just because as the process of heating them, which you need to heat them quite high to remelt them, damages the molecular structure. So they can only go through so many times before these polymer chains get too broken to be used in the same thing. The other thing they do is they add virgin plastic quite often to the recycling process. So let's say something says 100% recycled plastic. It might not be. It might be 80% plus 20% virgin plastic to make the product. So yeah, eventually it will be downcycled if it gets to that stage, which again only 9% does. So most likely, it never gets there.
Another question from James Nicotine. What do you think of the potential for ALGAE to replace single-use plastics?
ALGAE. I'm not sure what that is. Could they define it?
James?
Oh, like just algae, seaweed? Well, it depends on the end of life, really, of the product. Oh, I'm sorry, how the product behaves in the end of life. If it behaves like a plastic doesn't really break down or turns into micro particles of it, that you could see them, and so can the little things that like to eat, little things floating in the ocean. If that happens, then it isn't really better. So it really needs to be something that can be broken down very quickly, or possibly if it can be nutrition for sea creatures, then probably no problem. I don't know enough about it to really comment more than that, though. Yeah, the problem, so we've got one question. What about waste elimination with fast oxygen gasation, 2000 degree temp as alternative to landfills? That's, landfills take up space and they release gases and leach into groundwater and cause all sorts of nasty things. If you burn products, then all you're doing is you're releasing them faster, essentially. So the question is whether we can really keep using plastics when we know that it's essentially the same thing as burning petrol. They're made out of petrol. They turn into carbon dioxide and ethylene and stuff like that. So it might be better for running out of space, but all it's doing is it's accelerating the process. So I don't really know enough to comment more than that. And we don't need a banana wrapped in plastic. Bananas come pre-wrapped. There are a lot of things that we just simply don't need packaging or wrapping or plastic for. And I think it's become so cheap, and the rationale of making profit has caused a lot of these things, because if a banana, or we'll say a cucumber, which also sometimes comes wrapped, ends up getting dirty, they might not be able to sell it, or maybe not sell it for as much. But what is the impact if that cucumber gets thrown away? It's a couple bucks, it's whatever resources went into making it, not going to do any additional damage. But the moment you add a plastic component in there, you've done damage. It's something that's going to last for potentially 450 years. There was a good question up here as well from Anna V's, which said, do you think the use of plastic can really be taken into the hands of consumers, or do you think it needs to come from government and legislation limiting the use of plastics or importing plastics? Is there anything on the horizon like this for New Zealand? There is a group, I think in New Zealand, it's called Product Stewardship. And they're trying to get something like that in legislation, that companies bear the ultimate responsibility for their products and their packaging. I don't like to say that it's the consumer's responsibility to deal with this stuff ourselves. Because I'd have to educate, or well, not me, but the government would have to educate 5 million of us now. And that's just not realistic. I think if we're actually going to deal with this problem, it does need to come from a legislative direction.
Cool. There's another question there. How do we put the onus for packaging on the manufacturer and take it off the individual?
This is where the R2S and the name of my podcast comes in. The initial idea I had before I decided to try to get into the communication side of things was creating a business that tries to advocate companies taking back their trash. So R2S stands for Return to Sender. And the idea there is that if let's say you go to the store and you buy a tin of beans and a wrapped banana and all that sort of stuff, if you can leave that rubbish at the store or bring it back to the store next time you go to the supermarket, then all of a sudden it's no longer consumer responsibility. And if that store has the right to, when the next bunch of bananas comes in, to take all the plastic that they were wrapped in and put it back on the same truck, then that goes back to the middleman or to the producer of those bananas, or the importer, probably in bananas case. And so you're putting the responsibility back up the chain to the people who actually have more of an ability to say, okay, actually we don't want to wrap this product, or can we use a cardboard packaging rather than a plastic packaging? And I think that's one of the main ways we could solve this problem, but I don't think as far as I know, there's no case studies showing this working. So it's all hypothetical.
There was another question here. Have you connected with Scion and the range of bioplastics? Can they be reused, or are they just single use?
So bioplastics, I think, is a step in the right direction, but I wouldn't be complacent. So the one that I've done a bit of research on is PLA, so polylactic acid. And it does seem that it's better. It says that it's compostable, but it actually isn't in the way that you think it is. We can't just toss it into our compost bin. It requires, I think it's 45 degrees and 90% humidity for 90 days before it will break down. So it's only commercially compostable.
Mhm.
Saying that it's better than regular plastic. So like they're better, but they're not really the solution, because when some of these bioplastics do go into the ocean, they still break down very slowly. There are no nutrients in them. So we still have that same problem of the sea turtle thinking it's a jellyfish, or the shrimp, not getting any nutrition. So, make it, decide for yourself, but I don't think they're their solution.
Yeah, Jackie mentioned here that COVID-19 will have an impact on this, as people are worried about food safety. Do you think that we're going to see more and more plastics coming in the supermarkets, or how do you think COVID-19 will impact?
So there's one story which I'd like to, or sort of, if so for the life of a carrot, okay? Someone in New Zealand will grow a carrot, he'll pull it out of the ground, he'll put it on a truck. Some other people will touch that carrot as it goes into these different crates, ends up at the supermarket where people pass by it all the time. People probably pick it up and decide, no, that's not the carrot for me. It goes back to your home, you drop it on the floor and it's ruined. Like, how is it that we can't, we view things in just the vicinity of which we can touch them? There are so many different steps in the chain which we wouldn't necessarily consider to be hygienic. When it comes to COVID-19, it is a serious thing, and we need to figure out ways of dealing with it, but plastic probably isn't the solution, especially since 1 in 10 people who die due to pollution. It's 4.2 million people per year just from air pollution, 9 million in total. So for the sake of, your health, your individual health, or the health of a few people, it's very hard for me to justify this huge casualty rate versus the chance that you might get sick. So again, I'd only make that call for myself and not for anyone else, though.
Sorry, I'm muted. Well, thank you very much, everyone. That's a really great discussion. I remember when I was growing up, when we have to go to the supermarkets, we have to carry our own bottles. If we were to buy cooking oil, you have to bring the bottles. Otherwise, there's no way that you can buy oil. But obviously, it's all about convenience in our lives at the moment. So you go to the supermarket, pick up a plastic bottle there. Anyway, thank you very much. We're moving on to our next session, and please don't forget, if there are any comments, ideas, or notes that you want to share, please complete the collaborative document that I have posted earlier on.